If you observe carefully what's happening to the purchasing power of cash right now, you'll notice something that should deeply alarm anyone who spent decades building retirement savings. While your bank statement shows the same numbers month after month, giving you a false sense of security, the actual value of that money is eroding at a pace most people fundamentally misunderstand. This isn't about temporary market volatility or short-term economic fluctuations. This is about a systematic, structural destruction of wealth that's already well underway. And if you're holding significant cash positions in 2026, you're unknowingly participating in your own financial decline. The numbers are stark. For someone with $500,000 in retirement savings holding 60% in cash, which is remarkably common among conservative retirees, we're talking about a real loss of $15,000 to $30,000 per year in purchasing power under current conditions. That's money you worked for, saved carefully and thought was safe, simply evaporating. By the time you realize what's happened, years of careful saving will have been quietly transferred away from you through a mechanism most people don't see until it's too late. But here's what matters most. This outcome is not inevitable. There are specific practical steps you can take right now to protect what you've built over decades of hard work. This isn't a prediction. It's a logical consequence of policies that are already in motion, policies that have been set and cannot easily be reversed. I've been studying monetary systems and their inevitable outcomes for over 40 years across multiple countries, multiple eras, and multiple monetary regimes. And what I've learned with absolute certainty is that certain patterns repeat with remarkable consistency throughout history. When you understand incentives, you understand behavior. When you understand the constraints authorities face, you understand the decisions they will make. And right now, the incentives facing governments, central banks, and large institutions are perfectly aligned in one direction, toward the systematic devaluation of cash. Consider three critical data points that reveal the operating reality of our current system. First, U.S. federal debt now stands at $38 trillion, representing 144% of GDP, the highest peacetime ratio in all of American history. Second, despite claims of normalization, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet remains at $4 trillion, nearly 5 times larger than it was in 2008 before the financial crisis. Third, real interest rates, when you subtract actual inflation from the nominal rates banks pay, have been negative or barely positive for the majority of the past 15 years. These aren't abstract statistics to debate. They're the operating conditions of the system we live in, and they tell us exactly what's coming for cash holders. To understand why holding cash destroys wealth in this environment, think of the monetary system like a massive dam holding back water. On one side of that dam, you have all the existing money in the system. Every dollar in every bank account, every treasury bill, every money market fund. On the other side, you have all the real goods and services that money can actually buy. Houses, food, healthcare, energy, everything that matters in daily life. When authorities add more water to this system by creating new money through deficit spending and central bank asset purchases, the water level rises on the money side. But the goods and services side can't expand nearly as fast. Your dollar bills don't physically disappear from your account, but each one becomes less powerful at commanding real resources in the economy. Now here's what makes 2026 particularly dangerous for anyone holding substantial cash. The dam is under extraordinary pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, and each source of pressure reinforces the others. We have ongoing government deficits running between $1.5 and $2 trillion annually, which means new money creation is structurally baked into the system regardless of who's in power. We have aging demographics across all developed nations, which means more people drawing on Social Security and Medicare while fewer and fewer workers support those programs. We have accelerating geopolitical fragmentation that's driving nations to weaponize their currencies and actively move away from dollar dominance in international trade. And we have an accumulated debt burden so astronomically large that even historically modest interest rates create completely unsustainable debt service costs, which inevitably pushes authorities toward inflation, as the politically easiest path of least resistance. History is an excellent teacher, and if you study it carefully, it shows us this exact pattern repeating over and over again. Let's start with August 15, 1971, when President Richard Nixon made the decision to sever the dollar's connection to gold. At that precise moment, millions of Americans holding cash in their savings accounts thought they were completely safe. After all, the dollar was still the dollar. The numbers in their bank accounts didn't change. But what they didn't realize, what most of them wouldn't understand for years, was that they had just lost their anchor to real value. In the decade that followed, the purchasing power of cash fell by over 50%. Think about what that means in human terms. A hardworking person who had saved $100,000 in cash in 1971, a substantial fortune at the time, found that by 1981, that same $100,000 could only buy what $41,000 would have bought a decade earlier. They still had their money sitting in the bank. The numbers looked the same, but more than half of its real value had been quietly, invisibly transferred away through the inflation tax. Now look at what happened after the 2008 financial crisis. The Federal Reserve dropped interest rates to zero and launched what they called quantitative easing, which is just a technical term for creating trillions of dollars out of thin air. Those Americans who stayed in cash, thinking they were being prudent and conservative, missed the 189% rise in the stock market from 2009 to 2019. But more importantly for retirees, they missed the 144% rise in residential real estate prices in many markets across the country. Consider a typical family with $300,000 in cash in 2009. They held on to that cash for 10 years. In 2019, they still had $300,000, plus perhaps $15,000 in accumulated interest if they were lucky. But here's the devastating reality. The house that cost $300,000 in 2009 now costs $432,000. They had been prudent, careful, and conservative with their life savings, and they had been systematically impoverished by monetary policy decisions made by unelected officials. Even the very recent experience of 2020 through 2024 demonstrates this same pattern playing out in real time. Governments worldwide unleashed what they called unprecedented stimulus. The United States alone created roughly $5 trillion in new money through various emergency programs. A careful retiree who had $400,000 in cash and short-term bonds in early 2020 watched as their purchasing power declined by 18 to 22% by early 2024. That's roughly $72,000 to $88,000 in real wealth simply gone. They hadn't spent recklessly. They hadn't made foolish investments. They had simply held cash while the system systematically inflated around them, transferring their wealth to debtors and asset holders. To understand why cash is particularly vulnerable in today's environment, you need to understand three fundamental principles that govern how debt-based monetary systems always behave. The first principle is this: debt systems always resolve themselves one way or another, and there are only four possible resolutions. You can have austerity, where government spending is dramatically cut and debts are painfully repaid over time. You can have outright default, where debts simply aren't repaid and creditors take massive losses. You can have wealth transfer or confiscation, where assets are directly seized or so heavily taxed that they're effectively confiscated. Or you can have inflation, where debts are technically repaid, but in currency that's worth far less than when it was borrowed. Of these four options, inflation is always and everywhere the politically easiest choice because it's hidden, it's gradual, and most importantly, most people don't understand who's really paying the cost until it's far too late. When you have $38 trillion in federal debt alone and over $200 trillion in total debt across government, corporate, and household sectors, austerity is politically impossible in a democracy. Default would crash the entire financial system, and direct wealth seizure would cause immediate social upheaval and probably revolution. That leaves inflation as the only viable path forward. And who ultimately pays for this inflation? Cash holders. Every single dollar of debt that gets inflated away represents purchasing power that's been transferred from savers to debtors. The second principle you must understand is that central banks and governments are not independent, objective actors seeking optimal outcomes for savers and retirees. They're human institutions responding to very specific incentives and political pressures, and those incentives point decisively toward currency debasement. Think of it like a restaurant that's been losing money month after month. The owners face three basic choices. They can close the restaurant and publicly admit failure, which is humiliating and politically unacceptable. They can try to find new investors willing to inject fresh capital, which dilutes existing ownership and is increasingly difficult when everyone knows you're failing. Or they can keep the restaurant operating while gradually reducing portion sizes, using cheaper ingredients and cutting quality, all while keeping the same prices on the menu. Which option do failing restaurant owners always choose? The third one, because it avoids immediate crisis and bankruptcy. Monetary authorities managing a debt-laden system face exactly these same choices. And they always choose to keep the system running while gradually reducing the purchasing power of the currency. The third option avoids immediate crisis, but it systematically harms everyone holding that currency. The third principle is what I call the stored energy problem, and it's crucial to understand. Imagine you decided to store food in your basement 30 years ago, thinking it would preserve your wealth and security for the future. You invested a lot of time and money into gathering that food, but you stored it incorrectly, and every single year, a small percentage of it spoiled and became worthless. After 3 decades of this slow degradation, you go down to your basement and discover that most of your carefully stored food is now completely worthless. Cash operates on exactly the same principle. It's explicitly designed to be a store of value, a way of preserving your labor and productivity across time. But it's a store that leaks value continuously and relentlessly through inflation. The leak might be 2% per year in good times, or 5% per year in normal times, or 8% or even 10% per year in bad times, but it's always leaking. It never stops. And in 2026, given all the structural pressures we've been discussing, that leak is accelerating beyond what most people can imagine. The energy you stored up through years and years of work and saving is dissipating into thin air, transferred to debtors and asset holders. Let me tell you a story that illustrates this perfectly. In 2006, 2 couples prepared for retirement, each with $800,000 saved. John and Mary moved everything to cash: money markets, treasury bills, high-yield savings accounts. Robert and Linda took a different approach. They kept 10% in cash, 40% in stocks with pricing power, 25% in real estate, 15% in commodities, including gold, and 10% in treasury inflation-protected securities. When 2008 hit, John and Mary felt vindicated. Their $800,000 was still $800,000. Robert and Linda's portfolio dropped to $620,000. But then the Federal Reserve created money on an unprecedented scale. From 2009 to 2019, John and Mary's cash earned 5% annually, while inflation ran 5%. Their $800,000 grew to $927,000 nominally, but was worth only $770,000 in real purchasing power. Robert and Linda's portfolio benefited from every aspect of monetary expansion. By 2019, they had $1,280,000 nominally, or $118,010 in real purchasing power, more than doubling their real wealth. Then came 2020-2024. John and Mary, still in cash, were hit by inflation. By 2024, their $950,000 had purchasing power of $690,000. After 15 years, they were poorer. Robert and Linda's portfolio grew to $450,000, representing $25,010 in real purchasing power, tripling their real wealth. This is the typical pattern when you understand the system. Now, how this affects you. If you're 55 with $600,000 in retirement savings, holding 70% in cash, that's $420,000 at risk. With inflation at 5 to 6% in your actual expenses, you're losing $21,000 to $25,000 yearly in purchasing power. Over 10 years, that $420,000 will show as $500,000 with interest, but its purchasing power will have declined to $280,000 in today's dollars. You will have lost $140,000 in real wealth by doing nothing. If you're planning to spend $75,000 per year in retirement, your $600,000 gives you 8 years of spending. But if inflation runs at 5% yearly, year 1 you spend $75,000. Year 5 you need $91,194. Year 8, $108,188. Your spending power falls 31% while expenses rise 44%. The gap widens every year. Healthcare costs rise 6 to 8% annually. Property taxes 3 to 5%, insurance 5 to 7%, food 4 to 6%. When you hold cash, you're betting these stabilize. They won't. Here's the mathematical reality. If you have $500,000 today and inflation runs at 5% for 10 years while cash earns 2%, you'll have $609,000 nominally. But that only buys what $374,000 buys today. You need $814,000 to maintain purchasing power. The gap is $205,000, 41% of your starting capital. That's the cost of cash's safety. Based on these principles, here are practical guidelines. First, cash has a role, but it's limited. You need 12 months of living expenses in cash for emergencies. If you spend $60,000 yearly, that means $30,000 to $60,000 in cash, not $300,000. Everything else needs to be in assets that keep pace with inflation and ideally grow real purchasing power. For the remaining 85 to 90%, allocate 40% to equities, but be selective. Focus on companies with pricing power, consumer staples, utilities, technology companies with dominant positions. Focus on international exposure to reduce dollar dependency. Focus on companies owning hard assets, quality blue chips, dividend aristocrats with 25 plus years of consecutive increases, energy and materials sectors. The goal isn't speculation. It's protection through ownership of productive assets, maintaining value across different environments. Allocate 25% to real assets. Real estate through direct ownership or REITs focused on apartments, medical facilities, industrial warehouses, properties people need regardless of conditions. When inflation hits 5%, landlords raise rents 5%. Include infrastructure, toll roads, utilities, cell towers generating inflation-adjusted cash flows. Include commodity producers benefiting from expanded margins when prices rise. A productive farm still produces food. A functioning apartment still houses people. Nominal prices change, but real value persists. Allocate 15% to inflation hedges, Treasury inflation-protected securities. Adjust principal value based on consumer price index changes. Include gold and silver, 7 to 10% of total portfolio. Physical metals held directly or through allocated storage, not paper derivatives. This isn't betting on gold prices. It's having wealth central banks can't print that maintains value across every monetary regime. When the dollar loses 5% purchasing power, gold historically maintains its purchasing power. It's monetary insurance. Allocate 10% to short to intermediate term bonds from creditworthy issuers, not long-term bonds. They lock in low rates while purchasing power declines. Short-term bonds provide income while maintaining flexibility. Keep the final 10% in cash for liquidity and emergencies. Avoid long-term bonds at low nominal rates. Avoid investments you don't understand. Avoid concentrating in a single asset class. Avoid trying to time the market perfectly. Most critically, avoid paralysis that keeps you in cash because alternatives seem risky. The biggest risk is doing nothing. Implement changes gradually over 6 to 12 months. Don't transform your portfolio tomorrow. Average into positions. If you have $400,000 in excess cash over 12 months, that's $33,000 monthly. Each month, buy target allocations proportionally. Create a written investment policy statement documenting target allocations, rebalancing triggers, and decision rules. This prevents emotional decisions during stress. Prepare psychologically for volatility. When you own real assets, nominal values fluctuate. This feels scary compared to cash's false stability. But cash stability is an illusion hiding systematic purchasing power destruction. Over long periods, volatile assets preserve wealth while stable cash loses it. Set rules and follow them regardless of how you feel in the moment. Nothing here constitutes specific financial advice. Each person has different circumstances, time horizons, and risk tolerances. Consult qualified financial professionals before making investment decisions. This analysis is educational, explaining principles and patterns, not prescribing specific actions for your unique circumstances. The pattern is clear. Governments facing large debts choose inflation. Central banks create money. Cash holders pay. This has happened throughout history. It's happening now. The choice is yours. But observe what institutions actually do. Central banks have been gold buyers for 14 consecutive years. Sovereign wealth funds reduce dollar exposure. Pension funds move to inflation-protected strategies. Major corporations hold minimal cash. Family offices have reduced cash to historical lows. These aren't speculators. They're conservative wealth managers who understand. In a world of expanding money and large deficits, cash is not safe. Productive assets are safe. That's why this channel exists. We observe signals before they become obvious. We study what institutions do, not what media suggests. We analyze incentives and historical patterns. When the dam is under pressure, you move to higher ground. The dam is the monetary system. The pressure is unsustainable debt. And higher ground means assets maintaining value regardless of currency. If this makes sense, if you see the pattern in rising costs and stagnant cash returns, if you understand that conventional safety might be danger, subscribe. We'll continue analyzing patterns, discussing strategies, and explaining the forces shaping your future. Not predictions, but observations about what's happening and the logical consequences. Productive assets, companies making things, real estate housing people, commodities fueling life, will have value because people need them. Paper claims, including cash, will lose value because authorities must inflate. Which side you're on determines whether your retirement is comfortable or whether you watch savings evaporate despite decades of discipline. You work too hard to lose it through misunderstanding money. The knowledge is available. The pattern is clear. Choose wisely.